BYU basketball goes 2-0. Does Dallin Hall have his swagger back? Plus, Tom Holmoe stepping down from the athletic department as athletic director. Our thoughts on him, plus who the new athletic director should be. That's all coming up on the Loyal Cougars Podcast. Hello and welcome to the Aptive Podcast Studio. This is the Loyal Cougars Podcast, where we are talking about what you, the fans, are talking about. I'm your host, Jake Edmonds, joined today by Tosh Mackintosh. Tosh, how was your All-Star weekend?
It was great. I did not watch the All-Star game.
Yeah, as most people did or did not.
I grew up a huge NBA fan, but I'm part of the masses right now that it feels like it's lost some of its appeal.
It's pretty sad that the highlight of the entire All-Star weekend is a dunk contest that's won by a guy who's not even in the NBA. He's
Correct.
in a G League.
Yeah.
Now, I will say Mac McClung had some, as he has the last 2 years, had some phenomenal dunks, and it seems like he never misses a dunk, but the games itself, and I say games because this year they changed the format and actually played multiple All-Star games and made it like a tournament format. It just didn't help. I think the reality is you can change the format, and I tweeted this, you can change the format as much as you want with the All-Star game. It's not going to be a good product until the players start caring about it.
Yeah.
And I get that that's why they're changing the format, but it's just not, they just don't care. Like, even if they're losing in this tournament, they just don't care. And so that's not going to change. But this podcast is not about the NBA, and so that's all we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about something that BYU fans have loved to see so far this last week, which was 2 wins. One was a quad 1 win, one was a quad 2 win. Both very quality wins for the BYU basketball team, and wins that they really needed to have. We'll first talk about. I actually want to talk about Kansas State first, even though that was the second game they played last week, because the reality was that was, especially like the first half, that was probably the best half of basketball that we've seen BYU play, and it was like a complete half, and they did it differently than they normally did. Which is, we're used to seeing BYU coming out and shooting threes and knocking down a bunch of shots from the outside and maybe not playing great defense, but they just blow teams out of the water in the first half because of their three-point shooting. I loved that they came out and they made a concerted effort to get Keba involved.
Yeah. He played incredibly. Like, it's funny, last week, and rightfully so, you were questioning, is he playing to his potential? Is he as good as people think?
I said he was an overrated defender.
Yeah. And it's like he heard you. Like, he had a fantastic week overall and just played huge. I was watching that game and thinking, when was the last time BYU had any center like him? And I think the answer is never.
Yeah. And
we may be looking back, he may be like a guy that in the future we're like, oh, if we could just find another guy like him, we'd be a complete team right now.
Yeah, he's this raw talent. He's got the size, he's got the broad shoulders, he can jump out of the gym. Like, he has all the physical aspects of an NBA center. And where he has struggled is being assertive, understanding, like, I'm the most physical, athletically gifted guy on the floor. And he will be this week too against Kansas. And he's going to have to show that, and we'll talk about this in a later segment, but he's going to have to show his physical dominance against a guy who has been physically dominant throughout the entire year, and that's Hunter Dickinson. But we'll talk about that later. But yeah, he's and I was, again, last week I said he was an overrated defender, and that's because of the expectations that I think fans have put on him to be kind of this next Rudy Gobert, this dominant defensive force that could just, almost be so intimidating that guys weren't going after him at the rim. It did not seem like before last week that guys were scared to attack him. Even guards were even getting up in him and scoring on him. And so, again, I think that it was a very concerted effort in practice last week that we're going to get Keita involved. And it showed from the tip. He actually, the first 2 or 3 possessions, I think he was involved on offense and defense on both sides. So on both sides of the floor, the first 3 possessions, he was, if not directly involved, indirectly involved in all three possessions. I'm gonna actually let's point out a couple of his plays. So, the first play of the game, Kansas State has the ball. Now he wasn't guarding Hawkins, but he affected Hawkins' first shot. He was actually in the paint, and Hawkins had kind of an open lane to the basket, but Keba was there, and so he had to kind of pull up and miss the shot. Then he runs the floor in transition, which I think we've seen before, but the guys have never found him. I think Yegor's looking kind of down the lanes, the outside lanes, looking for his shooters on the outside. He found Keba down the middle, and I think it was Yegor. But anyway, Keba runs the floor. I think he actually airballed his first shot and then caught it, which may have been called to travel, but wasn't in this case. And so he gets his own rebound and scores. Then he screens Saunders' defender to get him open for a three. And this was, I think it was Mag that was driving, and Saunders was out in the other corner, the opposite corner. And Mag just kind of screened his defender, and Saunders was open for a three. Then he blocks Hawkins, he blocks Gassan, and then he seals his own defender for a nail open layup, I think twice, two possessions in a row. And so he was just so involved the first 3 or 4 possessions of that game that you could tell this is going to be a Keba Keita game.
Yeah. My test for me is if a player stands out and my wife notices them, who doesn't even know basketball at all.
Yeah.
And we're at that game and she's like, so that Keita, he's going to be able to play in the NBA, right? And I'm like, well, he's looked like it today. He's a little undersized for a center in the NBA, but it still stands out that when she, with her little basketball knowledge, when a player just jumps off the floor, it means he's doing something real good.
Yeah. And again, BYU just finding new ways to win games. So Keba finishes with 9 points. I think he missed a free throw that would have been 10. So he would have had a double-double had he made that free throw. 9 points, 11 rebounds, 5 blocks. And the 5 blocks is huge. He's one of 7 players this season in the Big 12 to record 5 or more blocks in a game. And again, this is coming, from me, who said that I thought he was an overrated defender last week. He certainly proved me wrong this week, and it's great to see BYU being able to win a game despite shooting 26% from 3. Because again, that's been their bread and butter. When they win games, it's because they shoot well from 3. When they lose games, it's because they don't shoot well from 3 and they go on these scoring droughts. They showed through their defense, and Keba was the anchor of that, at least when he was on the floor, that they can win games despite not shooting well from 3.
Absolutely. It was their best defensive performance of the year. I mean, that's what really just took Kansas State out of the game and never really let them back in it. The other big thing that stands out to me was Dallin Hall. Mm-hmm. In both games this last week, but right from the beginning of, in the first half against Kansas State, I texted a friend who's a real basketball guru, and I'm like, it looks like Dallin has his swagger back. And sure enough, it just continued on. His confidence in breaking down that defense and taking the open shot when he had it, He just seemed engaged and like he knew he could be our best offensive player. And we saw that last year, and we're a whole different team when we have him coming off the bench with that sort of swagger. It's like we could be scary if that's here to stay.
Yeah. So 16 points, 3 assists against Kansas State. And I actually thought he was elite defensively. Him and Saunders on Coleman Hawkins, who's, a forward, right? This guy is a big guy. And I love that Kevin Young trusted his 2 guards, Richie and Dallin. Dallin's physical, right? Dallin's he's a strong guard. And so for Kevin to trust Dallin to guard Coleman Hawkins, the play that comes to mind is when Dallin is, Coleman's backing him down. He did this a couple times in the game, by the way. He just tried backing Dallin down, and Dallin wouldn't budge. And there was the one possession where Richie kind of came in and almost faked a double team. He just kind of reached in a little bit, and it forced Coleman to kind of spin towards the baseline and lose possession. And that's when he tried to, save it from going out of bounds and throw it off Dallin. And it resulted in a fast break turnover and a Richie Saunders layup on the other end. And that was the epitome of that game. for a guy like Coleman Hawkins, who, he's an NBA talent, like he's projected second round pick, for him to score just 6 points, and scouts are kind of touting his defense too. Like he's a versatile defender. We talked about him last week, and not only were Dallin and Richie defending him well, and they only allowed him to score 6 points, they were blowing by him on the offensive side of the floor. So they were essentially taking Coleman Hawkins out of this game, which I thought was huge because, again, this guy is an impact player. Granted, they have 3 or 4 different guys that can score, and we saw what Doug McDaniel could do. But for them to take a guy like Coleman Hawkins out of that game, I thought was pivotal.
I got one other kind of take from this game. I think that one of the keys is that Yegor is realizing, or the coaches are imposing on him, that he is an elite passer right now, but he's far from an elite shooter. And so don't shoot it unless it's the obvious shot. He only shot 4 shots in that game. And I'm not hating on him. I thought he had a huge impact. He actually had his 8 assists fairly early, and he really got our offense going, especially in the first half. But he just didn't have these low probability shots that he was jacking up, which it's been a seasons of up and downs for him. And at one point, I was like, hey, he needs to get his confidence back. But then all of a sudden, it's like he got too much. And he was jacking up contested threes, and that is never his game. It's not his game this year. Maybe in the future, but right now, we need him to make the right basketball move. Don't shoot it unless that is the high probability open shot, and he played that way this last game.
Yeah, and there was actually one possession where he had a fairly open shot at the top of the key in the first half, and he passed it up and went to the corner for Richie, who made the 3. So, like, yeah, you're exactly right. I didn't even realize he only had 4 shots, 2 of them from 3. So he was not kind of his usual, I'm going to dribble into a 3-point shot. Now, against West Virginia, they needed that from him, especially down the stretch, right? Him making that just circus 3-pointer going to his left, that essentially won BYU the game, because I think it put him up and it forced West Virginia to start making, trying to make the kind of the hero ball play, and then it resulted in them having to foul, and BYU made their foul shots. But that was such a huge shot from him against West Virginia. I would say just in general, Yegor and then Boscovich, who I actually mentioned in last week's show. I said I wanted to see more Boscovich. I love that we saw him against West Virginia, because that wrinkle, again, and I love that he kind of provides this spark. Granted, he's not like the best defender. He's not going to post you up. So I think, like, Foose has his advantages. Keita, we've already talked about his advantages on defense. I love that Boscovich adds kind of this third wrinkle who can pick and pop. He can also play the 4. We saw lineups with him and Foose on the floor at the same time. But him and Yegor down the stretch in the last 5 minutes against West Virginia were massive. And I think Cannon was great as well. I think, Trey Stewart, we can talk about Trey, the bench in general, but in clutch time, which is when BYU has struggled, and that's why I actually think this West Virginia game was another way that BYU showed that they can win games, because they've historically not been great down the stretch in close games, on the road especially. And so Yegor had, he kind of developed finally this clutch gene, it felt like, where, he made that shot. He found Boscovich. They were making free throws down the stretch. But that West Virginia game showed that they can, they can pull away in clutch time, which I thought was huge.
Yeah, it felt very different. Like Kansas State, we got up and we held a pretty massive lead the whole game, which we needed that type of win. West Virginia was also a unique win that I can't think of BYU having another one like this season, where it felt like we stole it at the end.
Yeah.
In their place, down for the most part the entire game, but we were just pesky enough to keep it close. And then right in clutch time, let's swoop this thing and walk out of here.
Yeah.
And I loved that. Fun win. And I think that we had some luck. Yegor, he had to shoot that. The clock was winding down on the shot clock, defended. He was like way past NBA range, but just drills it. Happy for him, happy for the team. But at the same time, I think the commonality between both our wins last week, and in every type of basketball game you need this, is they did hit their free throws.
Yeah.
And we've been a bad free throw team all year, and we had two pretty dang good free throw games in a row.
81% against Kansas State and 76% against Kansas State, 81% against West Virginia.
I'll take those
I
all
love
day.
that. Yeah, I mean, we've seen them lose games because of their free throw shooting. The other thing I wanted to bring up, and this was mentioned on Cougar Board, Powerbait DPM said, one thing I've noticed the past 2 games is that it seems like Mag has been tasked with essentially making it a 4v4 game, taking away a team's star / leading scorer. He didn't do it as much last game, but that was definitely his role against West Virginia. And I would argue and he says last game, meaning Kansas State. I would actually argue he did it just as much against Kansas State, against Doug McDaniel, as he did against West Virginia and Javon Small. Now, McDaniel still got 22 points out of it, but McDaniel is a distributor. Like he is the guy that initiates the offense and makes everyone else look good. Granted, he also gets points. He can score as well, but he only had 2 assists in that game against BYU, and he's that catalyst, and I loved that both against West Virginia and against Kansas State, Mag wasn't just guarding him closely; he was guarding him closely for the entire floor. Like he was picking up his guy.
I love that.
Every time BYU made a shot, he was picking up McDaniel or picking up Javon Small full court.
And you got to be so annoyed as a player when you're having to just deal with some pesky defender.
Yeah.
The entire court.
Javon was literally walking around. I mean, like, he wasn't even trying to get the ball. He was, like, kind of directing his players, like, go here, go here, go here, all while Mag is, like, within a foot of him, right? Like, high school dances, you put, like, the book between the players. He was well within that book, right? He was guarding them so closely and not even allowing them to take the ball down the floor, which, I think when you look at individual play, like that's maybe not a big deal. Like they have other guys that can score, but again, like these are their point guards. These are their floor directors. These are the guys that initiate the offense. And when you take them out of the game, you take their offense away from them. They have to find some way else to score. And both teams, I think, struggled to score because of what Mag was doing, locking down those guys.
The other thing that's been fun, but at the same time, it's still going to be this puzzle that's going to be hard for Kevin Young to figure out down the stretch is we play so many freaking guys.
Yeah.
I had friends texting me about it. There's a comment that really kind of sums it up on Cougar Board. LB Mango says, I really like how Kevin Young is playing 11 guys and utilizing them in ways that increase BYU's chances for success. I love how guys like Stewart and Boscovich and Baker are used for specific purposes and how they are doing well to gain experience, playing time, and confidence. Stewart has been great lately, and Boz and Baker have both had games they've really had a positive impact. And look at how Hall is really blossoming now. He's been great lately. It's like we're playing 11 guys real minutes.
Yeah.
Most teams, Kansas State last week, they played 7 guys. They really played 8, but one guy just had 4 minutes. So really they played 7 guys. And that's pretty consistent in the Big 12. We are the outliers playing 11. When it works, it's fun. I have some concerns of, are we going to be able to make that work down the stretch? But there's advantages and disadvantages to it.
Yeah, and I would say it's actually, I would rather have at this point in the year, I would rather have too big of a lineup and have guys staying engaged and then maybe pulling it back in the tournament or whatever, in the Big 12 tournament even, or down the stretch in the last week of the season, than having an 8-man rotation.
Yeah.
And having to, maybe dealing with an injury late or having a guy like go cold all of a sudden, then you have to find a spark, and it seems like too little too late at that point. And it's not like the guys that Kevin Young's playing are bad. It's not like he's just like giving guys minutes because he's trying to keep them engaged and they're just like performing poorly, and so he has to pull them out. Like Trey Stewart, I think, provides a spark that they need, and not just offensively but defensively. I love that he comes in and with like 2 minutes left in the first half, he always that's like Trey Stewart time, right? Like he always comes in and scores. It seems like it's most likely a 3-pointer as well. but like that's the spark they need. And granted, he's not coming in for very many minutes. He only played 6 minutes against West Virginia. I think he played more against 7:58 against Kansas State. So he's playing less than 10 minutes a game, right? And so like, but he's happy with that. I think like he'd much rather do that than come in during garbage time. So
I didn't realize he only played 6 minutes against West Virginia. He had 8 points in 6 minutes.
I know.
That's very powerful. In a game that we, again, stole at the end,
Yep.
That makes or breaks the game.
And then Boscovich, and then obviously like Dallin Hall is, I think, the best bench player they have, and I think he's definitely their sixth man, right?
Yeah.
But, and for him to gain his confidence back is huge for the bench. By the way, BYU's bench scored 41 points against Kansas State and 38 against West Virginia. I mean, that's like half their points, right? So like the bench is clearly pivotal, making their impact in this game. I do think the only downside to playing so many people is that obviously you're losing minutes. Other players are losing minutes. I think Cannon is a big part of that. I think he's losing quite a few minutes.
He only had 8 minutes in the last game.
Yeah, so his minutes are diminishing. I think that's probably necessary because he is kind of gone cold. Ever since the Baylor game, he's kind of gone cold. I think he actually had a good game against West Virginia, but again, when you bring in a guy like Trey Stewart or bring in a guy like Boscovich, like some people are going to have to miss out on minutes, and I think Cannon is probably the biggest recipient of that. Obviously Foose and Keita are also sitting. Foose and Keita, when Boscovich is coming in at the 5, they're not playing as many minutes, but I think they're fine with that. But again, I think for the team as a whole, being able to play 11 guys and being able to play 11 guys that are all making an impact is a positive thing. And I hope we see more of it. I would love to see Cannon make more of his minutes. But until then, like I'm fine with playing 11 guys and I think it's allowing Kevin Young, and it's weird that we're still experimenting with rotations, with like 3 weeks left in the season. But I think it's allowing Kevin Young to figure out like who plays well with each other. And I think that's part of why Dallin is playing so well, is because Kevin Young's putting him in with guys that gel way better with Dallin than who he was playing with before. I think Dallin's actually playing fewer minutes with Yegor on the floor.
Yeah. No, and I think that is the key, is that Dallin's at his best with the ball in his hand. He really needs the ball in his hand a lot, and when you have Yegor out there with him, that's not going to happen. So that's been the key, I think, to unlocking Dallin lately.
All right, so BYU has a massive week ahead of them. Obviously, Kansas on Tuesday, and then they go to Arizona on Saturday. We're going to talk about kind of the repercussions of this week and whether or not how we think BYU is going to fare against both teams, starting with Kansas on Tuesday. That's coming up on the Loyal Cougars podcast. This episode is brought to you by Aptive. Aptive believes that every home should be enjoyed. They tailor their pest control treatment plans to target pests when and where they're most active. Plus, if you see pest activity between treatments, Aptive will return to take care of the problem at no additional cost. It's their way of making sure every customer is satisfied and every pest is controlled. If pests stay away, Aptive is why. Visit goaptive.com/loyalcougars or call 844-966-4787 and mention this promotion to get your initial treatment for just $29. That's goaptive.com/loyalcougars or call 844-966-4787. Get home field advantage with Aptive. Looking to get your brand in front of BYU's most engaged fans? The Loyal Cougars Podcast and Cougar Board are your perfect match. Cougar Board is the largest online community of BYU fans with thousands of posts every day. The Loyal Cougars Podcast is the official podcast of Cougar Board, and we have sponsorship opportunities available both for the podcast and the site. Contact us at sponsorships@loyalcougars.com, and we'll help your message hit home with the Cougar faithful. Again, that's sponsorships@loyalcougars.com. All right, welcome back to the Loyal Cougars podcast. BYU with a massive week ahead of them, starting with Kansas on Tuesday. We watched Kansas, you and I both, play Utah on Saturday. Were you impressed?
No, Kansas looked like they didn't have like a guy that could get a bucket when they needed to, which Kansas should be filled with those guys. But yeah. And then their giant skilled ogre in the middle, Dickinson, it's like he really was neutralized.
Yeah, and he wasn't playing against elite defensive bigs, right?
Yeah.
Like Utah doesn't have those guys. And it was wild. I mean, he was he was at the rim and missing bunnies at the rim.
Yeah.
And for a guy who averages 16, 17 points a game, I guarantee that's not going to happen probably again this season. So, like, I don't think and I agree with you. I was not impressed at all. Zeke Mayo, I don't even know the box score. Like, none of their guys felt like they could score. Like, they were missing from three. Utah, by the way, wasn't playing well either. Like, they weren't scoring. They were missing free throws. They obviously scored more down the stretch, but like Kansas offensively looked terrible. And I don't think we'll get that on Tuesday. I do think the environment at the Marriott Center is going to be more difficult for them to score and to dominate and to go on runs and to sustain drives. But I don't think they're going to be that bad. Now, they have been on a bit of a decline. So they've lost 4 of the last 7. They did lose at home to Houston in overtime. So that's not a bad loss. But then they lost at Baylor, at K-State, and then again at Utah, like we mentioned. They did win 3, which were at home against UCF. They won against Iowa State at home and at home against Colorado. So 3 of their last 4 losses have been on the road.
Yeah.
And so they're still on the road. They're in Provo. Like, does that streak continue, or do they find a way to turn it around? I think BYU's win against Kansas State, who, they had beaten Kansas, they had beaten Arizona, they had beaten Iowa State. Like, they were, as they said in the broadcast, the hottest team in America, right? Like, I think that should give BYU the confidence they need to at least come into this Kansas game and think, like, we can, despite the fact that these guys are a top 20 team or top 25 team, hopefully they still are coming in. I imagine they will be.
Closer to 25, probably.
Yeah. Yes. And we're recording this on a Monday morning. The rankings will come out later this afternoon. They will still probably be in the top 25. But I actually think, and I mentioned this last week, I was actually more worried about BYU going on the road and playing West Virginia than I was about them coming home and playing Kansas in terms of, like, odds of winning. And I still feel that way. I think that BYU in the Marriott Center is a completely different team than they are on the road. And we saw it against Kansas State, and I think that they have the ability to beat a Kansas at home, especially when Kansas is struggling as much as they are and struggling as much as they are on the road right now.
So I think Kansas this year is really buoyed up by their name.
Yeah.
Like, if you really break down their wins and losses, the fact that they were 17th going into that Utah game and what they're getting seeded and projected in bracketology stuff too, it's like there's some blue blood, preferences going on there. But at the same time, they have stars, they have players. And to me, it's going to come down to, is Mayo hitting threes? When BYU has just gotten, our hearts ripped out this year, it's when, for whatever reason, we're just giving up three. And that's what scares me going into this game. But this is not the Kansas of old. I would give BYU a 55% chance of winning this game.
Yeah, Zeke Mayo, 42% three-point shooter in conference. He's second only to Richie, right? So you got the 2 best three-point shooters in the conference playing in this game. I think it favors BYU that we're in the Marriott Center, right? I think Zeke, as everyone does on the road, they typically struggle shooting. I think he will struggle a little bit. Plus, you have Mag. Mag. Now, granted, their best offensive player, their best scorer is Hunter Erickson or Dyke Dickinson.
Yep.
In terms of points per game, right? Can Mag shut him or not? Mag's obviously not going to be guarding him, right? That's what I'm getting at. Is Mag's not going to be able to guard their best offensive player like he has at least the last couple of games. And it seems like the Big 12 is a very guard-heavy conference, right? So Mag being assigned on everyone's best guard is typically their best player. He's obviously not going to be able to guard Dickinson. But
yeah, it's going to be interesting. Can Keita, Foose, and Boscovich, can we find ways to really slow down Dickinson? I don't know. I think
Keita can hold his own. And again, Dickinson was just not impressive against Utah's bigs, and they don't have an elite defender.
Yeah, they had their best big that game was Jake Walleen, and he's more of a 4. And then it was strange to me that Dickinson was struggling against their really skinny fives.
Yeah, and I don't think Lovering was that great against him. Like, he just missed shots. So I think Keita can hold his own. I do think if Foose or Boscovich are guarding Dickinson, by the way, I think Kevin Young's going to try his best to make sure that doesn't happen. I think he's going to basically sub Keita in when Dickinson's in. But if there's some sort of mismatch, or or even if he gets switched off on with from a guard or whatever, they're going to double the heck out of him. Because outside of Mayo, they've got one other guy, but really it's Dickinson and Mayo. And so if you can force Dickinson to kick it back out, like, that's a win, right? Or if you can force him to put up a bad shot, that's a win. So I think Keita can hold his own, and I think anyone else, they're going to double him. But that said, I think BYU has traditionally this year struggled to defend the perimeter. But if you can put a guy like Mag on a guy like Zeke Mayo and, double team Hunter Dickinson when he gets the ball, you kind of take them out of their offense. And I think at that point, you're up 10-15. That basically takes Hunter Dickinson out of the game, right? Because then they have to start, launching home run balls, putting up threes, which he can do, right? He's capable of. That's not what he's known for. He's gonna try and get to the rim. You can essentially take Kansas out of their offense pretty early on.
Yeah, it's a big game for BYU in that it is a big name. People watch Kansas. They follow Kansas. If BYU wins this game, it is a huge step into us making the NCAA tournament. Like, I think that it's almost like we would really have to fall apart to not be in. If we can beat Kansas, Arizona's a great chance too. This is a fun week for them.
Yeah, totally. And I said last week, there's a lot of meat on the bone, right? This is the week. I think if you go 1-1, you are in the driver's seat.
Yes.
To the point where, like, all you have to do is win the games that you're expected to win. At Arizona State, at home against Utah. I think they have West Virginia at home. You win your home games. You win at Arizona State. If you go 1-1 this week, you're fine, right? I think you're totally fine.
If you go 2-0,
if you go 2-0, you're in, right?
Yes.
I don't think it. I mean, I guess you could still completely plummet at the end of the year, but
and even then, if you did, you would still maybe get in. Like 2-0 this week would be monumental. It's a tough task, though.
So what does BYU need to do differently this week against Arizona than they did? By the way, I think that the way BYU struggles as they do on the road. Granted, they beat West Virginia. They've taken a big step in the right direction playing on the road. I don't see this Arizona game as a win. I think if you're going to get a win, it's going to be Kansas at home.
Well, Arizona had their will, like, just anything they wanted, they got offensively against BYU.
Yeah.
Like, the only reason we were close in that first half is because we were scoring like hotcakes too. Yeah. But then we kind of came down to earth, and they just never stopped scoring. And it was in a multitude of ways, but really the biggest thing was they were just blowing by our guards and then hitting floaters and mid-range twos. And it's like we've got to throw something else at them, personnel-wise or scheme, to not let them just get these pretty gimme shots every time down the court.
Yeah. I think the two things that need to happen in this game, they need to defend better, and that starts with Mag on Caleb Love, right? I think Caleb Love got whatever he wanted against BYU in the Marriott Center. They need to rebound better. They lost the rebound battle 45-30 in Provo, and a big part of that was, and this is kind of why I was so hard on Keba, was he only had 4 rebounds in that game.
Yeah,
and he's got to average like 7 or 8 rebounds a game for them to be effective, because like Foose is not their rebounder. Like, granted, he'll come down with defensive rebounds or whatever, but like what we saw from Keba against Kansas State, we need to see against Arizona. And frankly, we need to see against everyone for the rest of the season, right? Like Kansas starting on Tuesday. But Keba with 4 rebounds against Arizona when they came to the Marriott Center, like that was a huge reason why Arizona was able to score as much as they were, because not only were they scoring pretty much at will, but when they didn't score, the few times they didn't score, they would bring down an offensive rebound and just put it back in. So Cabe's going to be a big part of this, but I think if they, like you said, if they go 1-1 this week, regardless of who it's against, if they lose to Kansas, beat Arizona, great. If they beat Kansas, lose to Arizona, great. They'll go 1-1 in Q1 play. The Big 12 will still be 500 against each other, as that ESPN analyst
Yeah, that's still funny.
Yeah. Mentioned. So anyway, that needs to happen.
What I would want to remind all BYU fans too is take a moment, deep breath, and just realize we are living the dream right now. A couple years ago, we were playing terrible conference schedules. I loved the West Coast Conference was nice to us. It kept us buoyed up. We had 1 or 2 or 4 total fun games a year. But we would have weeks and weeks and weeks where we're playing Pacific and Pepperdine. And this week we are playing Kansas in the Marriott Center and then on the road at Arizona.
Yeah.
Like how freaking awesome is that we get to cheer our Cougars on against big name schools with a lot of meaning on the line.
Yeah. And it's awesome that you can have a slip up like they did against Utah. By the way, Utah is now a Q1 loss for whatever reason. Like somehow Utah is now in the top 75. But you can have those kind of slip ups against the TCU and against the Utah and still be in the driver's seat to make the tournament. And that was just not the case in the WCC. And that actually kind of segues into our next segment because BYU is losing. I don't know if BYU fans really appreciate what they got in Tom Holmoe. And I think most do, but I think some don't. And him stepping down, congratulations first to Tom, for a phenomenal career and for a phenomenal tenure at BYU as athletic director. But him stepping down is a huge turning point, I think, for BYU athletics. And they've, it's almost, they've got to make the right decision for who they're going to replace or who's going to replace him. But we're going to talk a little bit more about that coming up on the Loyal Cougars podcast. We'll talk about what Tom accomplished as athletic director and who we think is going to be his replacement, who we want to be his replacement. That's coming up on the Loyal Cougars podcast. Why should you have to choose between style and repping your team? Wood & Grail is bridging the gap between modern fashion and college fandom. Their hats and apparel are made with premium materials like suede and corduroy, featuring bold, unique designs that let you show off your team pride without sacrificing your look. Whether you're at the game or out on the town, Wood & Grail lets you do both. Check them out at woodandgrail.com and step up your fan game. Use code CougarBoard for free shipping on any order. All right, so some pretty big news last week. Tom Holmoe, athletic director for BYU, stepping down. Tom's been around for a while, and I think he's led BYU through some of the most unprecedented types of events that any athletic department has probably undergone, and that's specifically conference realignment, missing out on conference realignment multiple times, deciding that hey, we think we can be an independent and be a successful independent, because teams have gone independent for the only reason they have is because nobody else really wanted them. Yeah, BYU could have stayed the Mountain West. Mountain West would have loved that, right? But I think BYU and Tom realize this is not our future. And if the Big 12 isn't ready for us, either in 2010 or in 2015 or 16, we're just going to be independent and just be available for when people need us. And, I think Tom at the helm was the right person for that job.
Yeah, it's been obvious the last few years that he has cemented himself as probably the greatest AD in BYU history. Though he's not dead, but at funerals, people oftentimes just talk about the good and act like this guy was a perfect guy. I do feel like his story is actually more nuanced than that, and it actually makes it even more incredible in the ending, is that there was a time where he was taking a lot of heat, and rightfully so, where at the beginning of his tenure, and a lot of this wasn't his fault, but he was at the helm when we didn't lock down Whittingham, and then Whittingham kind of took off. He was in control when Utah got invited to at the big boy table, and we got left behind. And then that happened again, and TCU left us. And then you have some of the longest streaks in basketball of not making the tournament. There was also the Satake years where we went to 5-7, we were losing to UMass, and he was the guy. And credit to him, credit to BYU's administration for realizing, he still is our guy, because let's forget about all that. In the end, Tom Holmoe won. Look at the hires he made with Kevin Young, with trusting in Kalani, and look how we've been in football lately. In looking at some really fun basketball teams, and then even our Olympic sports are crushing. And that we got to the big boy table finally, and there was a lot of politics that had to go into that. So credit to him, but it wasn't this smooth ride. There was a lot of plot and a lot of drama in that movie with a really happy, awesome ending.
And in his entire tenure, for as long as he's been athletic director of BYU, he never jumped the gun, went to the pulpit, and talked about how unhappy he was to join a conference. Unlike
he didn't have a Harlan moment.
A Harlan moment, but yeah, I agree. I think that you could look at some of his flaws. I think his and like you said, and I don't think you're pointing out his flaws as like, he had a lot of them. I think the point is he didn't have a lot of them, and honestly, his flaws were very minimal. I think, even though he didn't get Whittingham, he still got Bronco, and Bronco, Bronco turned the program around from where they were with Croton. And so Bronco, and he had a long tenure. I think that's part of it too, is that like, I think a good athletic director keeps their coaches around. And coaches like want to coach for a program under a good athletic director. Other coaches could have run, granted, good coaches will still run even with good athletic directors because they're getting paid more money. But like the fact that Bronco stuck around for as long as he did, the fact that Kalani has stuck around for as long as he has, and I know he's gotten offers to coach other places. But it's not just like football coaches, right? Like it's Dave Rose. He stuck around for as long as he did. It's now Kevin Young coming in. And then you look at like the Olympic sports, like you mentioned, Jen Rockwood,
Taylor,
the Olmsteads over volleyball. Like these are elite programs.
Yep.
That Tom, now granted, Tom's not coaching these programs, but he's like in the athletic department, hiring these coaches, bringing them in and retaining them and allowing them to recruit the way they do, to coach the way they do. Like I think Tom, what makes a great athletic director is a guy who is not incredibly hands-on. He lets his coaches coach. And that was Tom. Like Tom was like the epitome of a good athletic director.
And I think just spread goodwill. I think that one of the keys is, if we're being real, a lot of programs, a lot of conferences, a lot of coaches and ADs at other places didn't trust BYU. But I think his kindness and likability and trustability helped knock down some of those walls, that then it was like, okay, BYU is going to make us so much money, and we like Tom. We can trust these guys. Like,
yeah. So Shog and I on CB, Cougar Board, CB, he's actually got a history in the media in Utah. If you don't know who Shog is, pretty well liked among the Cougar Board community. He said, Holmoe has a reputation for knowing almost every BYU athlete by name. There are a lot of ADs that walk around like bigwigs and spend their time in inaccessible, fancy offices, luxury suites, inexpensive restaurants, barely interacting with their student athletes at all. The culture at BYU under Tom Holmoe has been the exact opposite of that, as it should be. I hope it doesn't change too much under the new guy. And I can actually speak to that as well because, working in media, I was a student reporter at BYU. I think that was my first real interaction with Tom, was being as a student reporter at BYU. And honestly, with the athletic department, with David Almadova, with Duff Tittle, Brett Pine, all fantastic people. And it's that culture that Tom has established. I didn't do an interview with Tom while I was a reporter at KUTV, but I set up an interview. And so during the setup process, you get to talk to Tom. And Tom was just like incredibly gracious, incredibly willing to just sit down and chat. Before and after this interview, and granted, he did the interview, I think, with Dave Fox or David James in studio. I just set it up as a remote, but the whole process was just seamless. And Tom made that work, and that's my minimal interaction with Tom. But hearing these accounts of the kind of person he is, I had actually heard that he knew most of his student athletes by name as well. He took that time, right? He wasn't this kind of elitist. I'm the boss. I'm delegating. I'm not interacting like that. That wasn't Tom. Like he was legitimately invested in his student athletes, in his coaches, in the media, in relations with the media. he was, like I said, he was exactly who BYU needed at that time for athletic director.
And he's always been that way, and he's had chances to not. I mean, he was an NFL football player and a dang good one, Super Bowl champ. He was a great college player. He was a head coach at a big program in football. But throughout all of that, he never let his ego make him where he wasn't approachable and kind, and that was a huge part of his success. And I think makes it a little tricky to replace him. I think that's where people are like, well, now what? Because it's very hard and rare that you can find a guy like him in that sort of position.
Yeah, so that is now BYU's biggest challenge is who do they replace Tom with? And there's the two obvious internal hires. They could go external. We don't know. I've talked with a couple of people that are somewhat in the know, and Brian Santiago is a real possibility.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a lot of reports out there that he's the front runner. Tom has, obviously given his endorsement.
Yeah, called him his right-hand man. Really gushed about
my
him.
guy.
Yes.
Tom and Brian obviously are very close. And we've seen, he doesn't have to say that. We know that, but we've seen them interact.
Yes.
In real life. You have a somewhat close relationship with Brian, at least more than some people, more than me.
Yeah.
Talk about that and what do you see out of Brian?
Yeah, so I moved into Brian's neighborhood 13, 14 years ago. So I've known Brian well over a decade, and he has never been anything but just great to me and my family. So that is part of things here, that I have a relationship and a friendship with him even. At the same time, the things that I and many look at as strengths, they scare some people. Like, he is a fierce competitor. Like, everyone that likes sports thinks of themselves as competitive. But then there's these guys that are just in the 0.01% of how competitive they are, and that's him. And that rubs people the wrong way. I'm not comparing him to Michael Jordan, but even Michael Jordan rubbed so many of his teammates the wrong way, and he doesn't have great buddy-buddy friendships with them because his competitiveness was hard to be around. And Brian is ultra competitive. There's also, he is very much wired on accomplishing his job. And I think it can be off-putting at times, but he views even conversations and time with, is this helping me or hurting me? And people see that, he spends way more time with the big, powerful people. But I think that he's doing that to try to help BYU. So long story short, I think Brian would be great. I do see some of the concerns people have. I would say, though, if we're trying to find another Tom, we're not going to do it.
Yeah.
You just got to find someone who's going to be great. And if they do hire Brian, he's got to hire the right number two that's the warm, fuzzy, nice guy. Chad would be fabulous.
Seems like the obvious fit in that. So Chad Lewis is kind of the second option in all of this. And just to lay out who Brian is, and this is obviously I loved what you talked about Brian as a friend. From my perspective as a member of the media, right? So it's kind of more of a distant observation of Brian. He's a bulldog, right? Like he sees what he wants and he goes and gets it.
Yeah.
And he will do whatever it takes to go and get that. And so if that means hiring a coach at BYU, he'll go and get that. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if he played a little bit of a role in getting Kevin Young.
Yeah. I'm aware that he played a big role.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's what you get with Brian Santiago, that like if he's in your corner, you are going to get a guy who will fight for BYU athletics and do whatever it takes to make BYU athletics successful. So as a fan, I actually texted this to a buddy of mine. As a fan, I would be thrilled if they hired Brian Santiago. As a person, as just like from a personal standpoint, he's brash, right? He can be pretty dismissive, especially when he views. So like if you're in a conversation with Brian Santiago, and somebody more important walks by, he will walk away from you mid-conversation and start talking to this person. Now, again, like his job at BYU is to schmooze boosters, right? Part of his job, not his job, not his entire job, right?
Yeah.
Like he does more than that, but like that's what he does, right? And like, you know, he'll go golfing with boosters. Like he's got this kind of like, for lack of a better term, cush lifestyle where he's schmoozing Ryan Smith. He's schmoozing a lot of boosters and
he's close with Ryan. He's close with Danny Ainge.
But he brings in a lot of money because of that, right? Yeah. Like he makes connections with boosters that is extremely needed, especially in this time of NIL. And so like that, but that's what you get with Brian. So that's the positive is that he will fight for what BYU athletics needs and do whatever it takes. The downside of that is he can be a little bit brash. And so like from a personal level, if you have a problem with that, then you know, Brian might rub you the wrong way, but I think as a fan, he's going to get stuff done that BYU needs to have done.
So to me, I'm hearing from people that are powerful people, mostly donors, that, hey, they think it's Brian.
Yes.
The other name that I have heard thrown out, not nearly as much though, but I believe his name is Barnum, he's the number 2 AD at Kentucky. And he is a member of the church and is tied in and has been in a Brian role at a big school for a long time too. I think, I'm not a betting man, but if I was, the Vegas odds right now would have Brian Santiago as the number 1 favorite. But I actually think the number 2 betting odds right now is that Kentucky guy that could swoop in. If they decide, hey, Brian's not it, I think that is their next safest hire.
And you know, I know nothing about the guy. And so the thing is too, like Brian is a BYU guy. Like Brian has been with Tom for so long that like he already knows how it runs.
And that's not to be minimized. BYU as a program runs differently.
Yes.
To get things across the finish line, to get people on board, you got to pull different levers in a different way and different conversations than if you're at Texas or Kentucky.
So Chad Lewis is also in the conversation. I think it's pretty well documented at this point that Chad's not ready for that position yet. He's either not ready or he just doesn't want it at this point. I think he's happy with what he's doing right now, which is working with the Cougar Club and working with boosters. I think he's fine where he's at. And again, I think his personality lends to more of a kind of a networker type of role as opposed to kind of a go-getter, like this needs to get done. He's a very kind guy. Like if you know Chad, like he's extremely nice.
Yes.
He's very personable, just like Tom. But he's a little bit passive, right? Like he's not, you know, it's crazy to think that Tom and Brian and Chad work in the same department and work together because they are completely different personalities. If you're going to take one personality over the other for the athletic director position at BYU, you're going to take Brian. And so I think Chad is a very distant candidate, if at all, at this point.
Yeah, and I'd be happy for him, but it would be a huge step from what he's been doing in the past. Yeah. And so like I don't know if that's the best for both. I'll support, of course, whoever BYU hires, but I think that it's probably going to be Brian Santiago. And I think that having a ultra competitive guy who just wants to win, that it could bring really fun, big things to BYU.
Yeah, agree. All right, Tosh, thanks for hopping on. As always, it's been a pleasure. I loved the insight you had on Brian. I'm glad I had you join for this week. We'll keep a closer eye on what happens this week when they hire the next athletic director. We'll give our thoughts on that. But for now, this is the Loyal Cougars Podcast. I'm your host, Jake Edmonds, alongside Tosh Mackintosh. We'll see you next week.